Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Marquette. We're so glad you're with us to stay curious. Got Steve Agid in the house with me today.
Nice to see
Steve?
you. Nice to see you, Mark.
Well, Steve Agid is a communicator out there at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex. And we're glad to have him on doing a program that's dear to my heart because we're both baby boomers and we lived this the Apollo 8 Christmas orbiting the moon in 1968, Christmas Eve. Something I'll never forget, Steve.
No, absolutely.
Being a young teenager like you, this Apollo 8 Christmas, of course, Apollo 11 on the moon, and the assassination of President Kennedy are etched in my mind. A lot of details of those days is what I say. And Steve's going to recreate that for us here today, the Apollo 8 legacy. So glad that you're all joining us on this pre-Christmas week. Well, it is Christmas week, I guess. Marty, my co-producer, and been involved with this. This is our fourth Christmas there, brother, I guess. December last week was 955 episodes of doing this, and you can see a lot of them on YouTube. And tell your friends they can see them at any time. In fact, we're airing this one a little early today because we just wanted to do it live. So if you got any comments and chime in. If not, make a comment. We always look back at the broadcast and try to reply to your questions there. So, Marty, good to see you here today and Christmas week. Want to just have you check out that UCAC family microphone. Have you been good or bad this year, Marty?
I can't believe you're asking. Of course I'm good.
He is good. He's one of the goodest ones. What an ace volunteer we have. Very good. And we've all had a good year, a challenging year somewhat here, but it is for everybody with the getting through the inflationary times. Steve, you can move that to your around the corner there on the bottom. I see you messing with that. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to enjoy, like I said, going through Apollo 8. What a bold decision it was after Apollo 7, 10 successful orbits, resurrecting the Apollo program after the Apollo 1 fire. And 1968 was fraught with incredible bad news everywhere you turned around in America. And this was a moment that we'll never forget. Before I get wound up with this with Steve, tomorrow we got Perry Baker Horner, a configuration management lady, is going to talk about the pieces and parts of that she kept track of during the shuttle era. Perry Baker Horner, looking forward to her visit here. Wednesday, we're going to talk about International Space Station Christmases and such with a little bit of current events. Thursday, we'll talk about backyard astronomy, what you're going to be seeing. The moon is dancing through the sky during Christmas week. And then, of course, Friday, I have to do my annual Star of Bethlehem. What was the Star of Bethlehem, the most famous star in the sky? And I have a good story for the Christmas holidays for that. So, Steve, glad that you're here. Last time you were here, you did a wonderful program on Skylab, the 50th anniversary. You set the bar pretty high, my friend there.
Okay.
But of course he does because he's a ace communicator out there at the Space Center. How things going this year in the holiday season?
Well, everything's going great. We just got a brand new exhibit. If the folks out there not familiar with it, you've watched over the last few months. You remember William Shatner's flight into space on a Blue Origin capsule.
Right.
Well, we've got a Blue Origin simulator out there now. You can go inside and have a virtual reality trip into space inside a Blue Origin spacecraft.
Fantastic.
Just opened up about a week ago, so we're looking forward to seeing
It's
a lot
in
of
the
people say-
Gateway, right?
It's inside the Gateway Center. That's right.
And Marty?
Mike.
Oh, the mic. Get the microphone a little bit closer there to you there. Okay.
Okay.
Mic you up there. Thank you, Marty, for shouting out there. Your voice is always outdoor level when you want it. You'll hear him out there in the Rocket Garden giving tours out there. You've also been a bit of an astronaut wrangler when our good friend Nick Thomas has taken a day off, and he deserves a lot of days off. Of course, Nick's actually younger than you and me.
Oh, really? That's good to know.
Yeah, he is. So we're glad to have, and we're going to get this Steve Agid in the queue here because he wants to share a lot of good stories, and you're going to enjoy this program today. But we want everyone to know that you were a space worker, Steve. What did you do?
Well, I was in the space program, well, coming up this past April, 50 years. My first job, oddly enough, is kind of like the job I have right now. I was still in college, and I worked for a few years at the visitor center during the rush periods, all summer, Christmas rush, Easter rush, as a communicator. Of course, we didn't call them communicators then, we called them interpreters,
Oh,
people
that's
that
right.
interpreted the space program. And then after graduating, I got a job with the RCA company where I got to meet astronaut Bob Sanker. We worked on the RCA communications satellites. I was a spacecraft and orbit analyst, figuring out where the satellites had to be, how to get them to where they needed to be, making sure they worked while I were on orbit. I did that for 12 years. Came down here right after the Challenger accident and worked on 59 space shuttle missions. My job, twofold. I worked in the payload office, so we had to learn whatever we could about anything the shuttle was bringing into space. So I worked on 5 out of the 6 Hubble missions, including the original launch and the Hubble repair mission, Shuttle Mission 61.
30 years ago this
That's
month.
yeah, it's coming up, and it's just the Chandra Observatory, the Gamma Ray Observatory, all 9 missions to the Mir space station. So getting to work with a lot of the astronauts and the cosmonauts and the representatives we have from all over the world. We have a very different view of humanity when you work out there because all those other countries are sending their representatives. It's the best of what that country has to offer. So we go day after day meeting the best of the people that a different country would send. And so you get to see what we're really capable of if we work together and do things together.
Well put there, my friend. And of course, humanity's view has changed forever by this scene here that's recreated in our green screen. Earth rising over the moon, first seen by these humans, 3 guys in this tin can orbiting the moon 250,000 miles away. And we're going to enjoy your program about that for sure. And thanks for all that you did with the space program. And
You're welcome.
I'd love to do a program on the Mir visits and
Okay.
all. Very interesting to talk to Wendy Lawrence about them. We've been there twice. She said, she didn't say pigsty, but that's what she meant. It was a lot of stuff everywhere. They never threw away anything. But anyway, Steve, you're always welcome here. But let's kick it off here with Apollo 8. Marty, do you have a note or anything over there before we proceed?
Mark, did you set that mic back up the way it was? You switched it a little while
I
ago.
got you. Yes, I was going to do that. Okay. There we go. Now we're
Okay,
back to
that's better.
we're back to the original setting there. We were experimenting around. I was going to do that. You're
Everything
fine.
else work?
You're fine. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Everything else is good there. So Apollo 8 flight to the moon there. And Marty's going to center that. And I'm going to let you take it away there as you just tell me to advance the slide, Steve, and take it away. What does with your program here?
Alrighty, we're going to begin with folks out there so you can see what the patch looked like. The patch has a big 8. Well, it's actually the trajectory of the Apollo 8 spacecraft that's going to take it from the Earth to the moon. But the triangular, not quite triangular shape, is supposed to be the capsule that they flew in. So that is what the spacecraft is going to look like. So it's the spacecraft that's going from the Earth to the moon with the names of the crew: Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. So that's the history of the patch itself.
Never
Let's-
really thought about the spacecraft being the triangle there.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Volume okay, Marty? All right, good.
Now, the way we're going to begin is right before the Apollo fire, which is kind of like where we are right now in our space program. We're about to really begin the Artemis program. So there's still a lot of ideas of how we're going to land on the moon. Right now, the original plan was Artemis 1, which was launched last year, was going to be the first test of the Space Launch System rocket. Artemis 2 coming up next November. It'll be a crew of 4, first time we've gone to the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. They're going to circle the moon, come back. Artemis 3 is supposed to be the landing. If all goes well, but there's talk, well, if Artemis 3 doesn't do it, maybe we'll do it on Artemis 4. So there's uncertainty in the exact flight order. But during the early days of our program, it's going to be exactly the same thing. And that's what this list is supposed to show you. Apollo 1 was not supposed to have a fire, obviously. So had Apollo 1 launched, what would have happened? Well, if you had a good Apollo 1, Apollo 2, what its job was to fix all the things that we discovered on Apollo 1. It's a brand new spacecraft, never been flown before. Certain things aren't going to work, or at least work as well as you think they should work. So we'll have a second flight to confirm that things are working as they should. Now, both of these spacecraft, this is very important. Apollo had two designs. We had what we call a Block 1 Apollo and a Block 2. What's the difference? Well, the Block 1 spacecraft were not supposed to go to the moon. They didn't have a docking system, so they couldn't connect to the lunar ship. You couldn't do spacewalks. The hatch would not open during the flight, so you don't have an opportunity to do that. But it was going to be an early version of the spacecraft. We want to make sure most of the systems work, so we're going to have a few flights using a Block 1 vehicle. Then, as time goes on, we'll get the new and improved vehicle. That vehicle will have a docking system. You'll be able to do spacewalks from it. Every single attachment we're going to need to do to go to the moon would be the Block 2. All right, so if we look at our mission status, we look at all the different missions we have planned. We are going to do a test of the Saturn V, then a second test, and if needed, even a third test. Then we have Apollos scheduled all the way out to Apollo 20, and we have the landing sites that are planned for them. So there's a lot of discussions of which flights would have gone, what would we have done, what the landing sites would have been. So on the left side of your screen is one of the tentative schedules they had prior to the Apollo fire. What actually flew, you'll see on the right side of the screen. There was the fire. One of the most asked questions I get out at the Space Center is when people go to the Saturn V facility, they look up and they see the Apollo 1 patch. And right next to it is the Apollo 7 patch. Well, what about 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? Well, here's a quick story. Well, Apollo 2, what it was supposed to do is, again, fix what you found out on Apollo 1. Apollo 3 was going to test that command ship at a much higher altitude. Apollo 4, what it was going to do is launch that Saturn V for the very first time. Well, since we had the fire, we knew we were going to be on the ground for about 20 months. Do you really think we ought to proceed with a capsule that's not going to go to the moon, or just go straight to the new design that has everything in it? And they took the Block 2, and that's when they decided, don't fix the Block 1, go straight to the full-up Block 2 model. We have 2 years to do it, and that's what they decided to do. So Apollo 2 and Apollo 3 got canceled. Apollo 4 became the first test of the Saturn V moon rocket. Apollo 5 was the first test of the lunar ship, the lunar module. Apollo 6 was supposed to be the confidence builder. And that was the mission that Apollo 4, the first test of the Saturn V, you always can expect something to go wrong or not work as good as you expected. Don't worry, we're going to fix it. When Apollo 6 goes, that second flight of the Saturn V, everything will be great. Well, in hindsight, things didn't work out very well. Apollo 6 was not the great confidence builder. There was a problem with what's called pogo, or shaking in the vehicle. One of the engines on the second stage shut down, and what made it even worse is the engines were cross-wired. So the engine that had a problem, telemetry came back and shut down the other engine. So now you lost 2 out of the 5 engines. You get to Earth orbit, the Saturn V third stage provides that last trip into Earth orbit. You're in orbit, you're going to go to the moon, so what we want to do is fire that third stage a second time, and nothing happens. We don't get a second burn. If this was a moon flight, it wouldn't get beyond Earth orbit. So rather than being a great confidence builder, Apollo 6 was a problem. And you could imagine the newspapers the next day what's going to happen. We'll explain why it didn't happen in just a few minutes. Apollo 7 now would be Apollo 7, the real Apollo 7, and from 7 all the way down to 17, they go as scheduled. The last 3 flights were canceled following Apollo 13 and 14. Those were the Apollo 20, 19, and 18 flights. Those were landings we expected to possibly be in the Copernicus crater, the Marius Hills. So we had various landing sites potentially planned, but 18, 19, and 20 never flew. Next. Okay, so we talked about the what-if scenarios. What if Apollo 1 was successful? Well, it wasn't successful, so let's go and see what happened, what the results was. Well, the Apollo 1 crew sadly is killed in a countdown test on Pad 34 on Friday, January 27th, 1967. Now, the Congress is going to be investigating it along with NASA. We're expecting to go to the moon, and you folks have an accident. Not in space. You have an accident on the launch pad, on a rocket that's not even fueled, on a test that's not even considered hazardous. The astronauts are on the ground, and you couldn't even get them out. You want to go to the moon? Well, of course, there's going to be an incredible investigation because of that. The astronaut representative to that investigation for the Apollo Fire Committee is an astronaut named Frank Borman, and he will be the astronaut representative at the Apollo 1 Fire Review Board. They'll be disassembling the Apollo 1 spacecraft, going to the different contractors, finding out what happened, why it happened, how can we prevent it from happening again. So that is going to be Frank Borman's job for the next 20 months as we're getting ready to fly again. So if we can go back to the slide, the Apollo spacecraft, he finds out that there's a lot of problems, everything in workmanship and how things are done. You have to remember that Project Mercury and Project Gemini used the McDonnell Company. Before there was McDonnell Douglas, it was the McDonnell Company. So they have built all the spacecraft from day one. You know, when Alan Shepard flew all the way till Apollo. New contractor is North American. This is their first crew flight. Well, there's about 1,300 design changes that they want to have. One of the big ones, of course, is the hatch. The Apollo hatch for the Block 1 spacecraft had 3 hatches. All of these had to be opened to get the crew out. We're going to a 1 hatch. Hit 1 hatch, opens up, and instantly the crew will be able to get out of the spacecraft. It's a lot longer process. Ed White, very, very, very strong fella, was at the West Point Academy, and he was in the center seat. It was his job to open up the hatches, and as strong as he was not able to do that job. And that's, again, the hatch was just a poor design on the Apollo Block 1 spacecraft. Now, for the rest of the year, we have our first Saturn V launch on November 9th. Worked fairly well. The Apollo crew is going to be Frank Borman, Mike Collins, and Bill Anders, and they're in training together. However, we find out that Mike Collins has a problem with his neck. It's a bone spur. He's going to be in not a flight condition for several months. So he's going to be removed from the Apollo 8 crew as the command module pilot. So who's the backup? A fellow named Jim Lovell. So Jim Lovell is going to be the replacement for Collins, and the crew now is going to be Borman, Lovell, and Anders. It's an odd situation for Jim Lovell. Why is that? Well, he flew with Frank Borman on the Gemini 7 mission. They were both rookies, and Frank Borman was the commander. But then Lovell flew again on Gemini 12. And he flew on Gemini 12 as the commander with this new rookie astronaut named Buzz Aldrin. So he was the commander, Buzz Aldrin was the pilot. Now you get to Apollo 8, and again, Jim Lovell is serving under Frank Borman. He used to be a commander, now he's just the command module pilot. But that's the way things worked out. Lovell's happy to get the job, and that's the crew. The crew has been selected. It's going to be Borman, Lovell, and Anders, the prime crew of Apollo 8. Now, the CIA has warned over the summer that the Soviets may have a moon-circling flight by the end of 1968. Now, America lost the space race to the Soviet Union when Sputnik was launched. It came in second when it came to a craft heading to the moon. It came in second with a craft landing on the moon. The Soviets did that first. It came in second when the first astronaut into space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. It came in second when we had our first spacewalk as Alexei Leonov beat Ed White. So we are following the Soviet footsteps all the way through the program. And now the target is the moon, and the CIA says it's on the verge of happening yet again. Well, no Apollo spacecraft has yet flown. We're getting ready to launch Apollo 7. Well, based on these pieces of information, discussions are held in the upper echelons of NASA. Let's think of what we could possibly do. And there's a discussion being made. What we might be able to do is send a mission to circle the moon and come back to Earth. See if we could beat the Soviets doing that. The only problem is Apollo 7 hasn't flown yet. So they make the decision, let's see how Apollo 7 does. You're trying out this spacecraft. Remember, everything you learn from the fire is going to be tried out on Apollo 7 for the first time. So let's not put our eggs in one basket. Let Apollo 7 do its job. But we want you to plan for it. So NASA Administrator James Webb talks to the Deputy Administrator Tom Paine, says make some tentative plans to see if we could possibly send Apollo 8 to the moon. Then if we go back to our figure there.
There we go.
Okay. And so Jim Webb, Tom Paine talks about that. Everything is based on Apollo 7 going well. Apollo 7 is launched on October 11th. It completes its mission. And now the decision is made. What are we going to do? Well, we're preparing the crew. Frank Borman is called in, tells them, what do you think about the change of the mission plan? And here's the oddity here. The crew is identified. That crew is supposed to work with a lunar module. The Grumman Company has advised the lunar module is just not going to be ready yet. So what do we do? So the decision is go without the lunar module. We will just send the command module to go to the moon. So the command module and the service module will go to the moon. Will go in December. Just make it a lunar flight and come back. Now there's another decision that has to be made. And this is something that, again, I want to explain to your listeners here about the differences between going to the moon and going in Earth orbit. I walk every day. A lot of people jog every day. If you do a 2.5 mile walk or a 2.5 mile jog, it's not much of a jog, 2.5 miles. And the reason I'm bringing up that is this, to give you an idea of the magnitude of the difference of going in Earth orbit and going to the moon. Earth orbit is 250 miles up. That's where the space station is right now, 250 miles up. The moon is 250,000 miles away. It's 1,000 times further than Earth orbit. So if you're used to doing your 2.5 mile jog every day, that's the difference between your 2.5 mile jog and jogging from here in Titusville all the way out to Los Angeles, California.
Wow.
That's 1,000 times greater. You wouldn't think twice about doing a 2.5 mile walk. You would think twice about walking to California. But that's what we're thinking of for Apollo 8. Not 250 miles, but 250,000 miles. When you're in Earth orbit, you're never more than an hour or two away from home. Something goes wrong, you can be home in an hour or two. Now, it could be days. That's just one of the things you're thinking about on a spacecraft now that has only flown once, and that was on Apollo 7. So the magnitude of that is quite amazing when you think of the navigation and such. Remember, this crew was not training to go to the moon, and now it is September or so. You're 3 months away, completely changing the mission, but the crew is actively engaged. They want to perform Apollo 8. Let's continue.
Well, 1968 rolls around. You said Apollo 7 successful in 67. What a year. And you've got that characterized here, the year in review.
And
talking with Steve Agid here and enjoying this trip down memory lane 55 years ago, double nickel.
And this is why the voyage becomes so important. It's one of the things, again, it's easy for Mark and I to talk about this because we lived through it.
Absolutely.
For those of you that haven't lived through it, and younger folks out there, I want you to take a look at this year of 1968. You ask anybody who was old enough to remember it, and everybody remembered 1968. There's so many things that happened that year. So let's begin month by month. In January, there was a ship called the USS Pueblo. It was captured by North Korea. The crew was detained in prison and tortured for the rest of the year. That's the way the year started. In February, in the Vietnam War, which has now been escalating, there was a famous Tet Offensive. 70,000 North Vietnamese entered the South. Now, eventually, the Americans would defeat them, but the idea this was a huge surprise. The amount of people dying in the Vietnam War rose week after week. Then came March. It's a presidential election year. Someone is actually challenging the incumbent president. President Johnson has a challenger, and his name is Eugene McCarthy. Well, they have the New Hampshire primary. Now, of course, the president is going to crush whoever comes up against him. Well, the president won by about 4,000 votes. In a primary, 4,000 votes is virtually nothing, which tells you the president is not in very strong shape in his own party. And so, just about 2 weeks later, the president announces he's not going to seek a second term. Well, that changes things. April 4th, I mentioned a few minutes ago, we talked about Apollo 6, the second test, the confidence builder of the Saturn V. Well, we had 2 engine failures on the second stage. The third stage is going to get us to the moon. It fired once to get us into orbit. It failed on its second attempt, couldn't get us out of Earth orbit. So this is a disaster. This is terrible. It's supposed to be a confidence builder. It was a confidence shaker. You can imagine what the newspapers are going to say about NASA. But it was relegated to a back page. Why? Because later that day in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. That became the headline story in the paper. Riots broke out across the United States, as you can imagine. So the failure of an engine on Apollo 6 just didn't match up. So May came. The person that took over for Martin Luther King was Dr. Ralph Abernathy. He led 2,500 people to camp out for a month right on the Capitol Mall called Resurrection City. The country was focused on that for a while. June came. Well, now that the president has gotten out of the primaries, he's not running for a second term, we got other people deciding to enjoy the chance of becoming the next president and be a Democratic nominee. That person was Robert Kennedy, former Attorney General, former brother of President John F. Kennedy. He gets into the race, and he wins the California primary, one of the biggest primaries in the country. He goes down after he makes his speech that's explaining that he won the primary. He's looking to go to the next state. He goes downstairs in the hotel, and right there in the kitchen, he's assassinated. We have 2 major assassinations in 2 months. Now, overseas, on August 21st, the Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries invade Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is trying to have what they call the Prague Spring, trying to establish democratic reforms in Czechoslovakia, and that is violently put down. At the end of August, riots occur at the Democratic National Convention in in Chicago. And 175 people are arrested. Over 100 people are hospitalized. It's an incredible scene of violence outside a political convention.
Yes.
Now, in October, you have the Olympic Games. Protests break out. 2 American athletes, Smith and Carlos, give the Black Power salute during the playing of the national anthem at the Mexico Olympics. People are divided about that. Comes November, Richard Nixon defeats Hubert Humphrey. He's going to become the 37th president. So this has been a really pivotal year. It has had nothing but a lot of really, really tense stories. People are just aggravated about everything. And that's the background I wanted to give you as we're getting ready to launch Apollo 8.
And it's December, holiday time. Spirits are trying to be lifted. This, as a teenager, just like yourself, us young men are saying, what are they going to do? Just kill people that don't agree with you? And I mean, it was really a amazing time. Contrast this, some of the greatest rock and roll music that they still play all the time, from the Doors to the Stones to the Beatles, all that going on. And here's Marty working on the lunar module number 4 and 5 to get us to the moon there. Marty, you got something to share?
Yeah, we also had race riots throughout 1968.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. The whole and to watch the news, Walter Cronkite, that always had a clip of tragedy in Vietnam, some poor young kid being drugged to a Huey helicopter to be saved or whatever. Just the pathos everywhere you turn. That's the word, Steve. Pathos, just everywhere.
I mean, they used to scroll up. I remember every week the Defense Department would announce how many people died that week, and they'd scroll the names from everybody, where I grew up in New York, of everybody from the area. And you just saw this. It was just one thing after another, without end.
Well, as space geeks, we could step out from that, and I had my telescope and all that but I'll tell you what, we will never forget 1968. And then these 3 gentlemen came along and were finally put in the spotlight of the world.
So now we have the Apollo 8 crew. This is the new crew. Frank Borman, he's the commander from the Air Force. He was selected in Group 2, the second group of astronauts after the original. Flew a 14-day flight in Gemini 7, the astronaut representative for the Fire Investigation Board, and finally selected for Apollo 8. One more thing I'd like to bring up about Frank Borman right now. During those congressional hearings, there were a lot of people that said, we're just not ready to recover from Apollo 1. We're not ready to go to the moon yet. We bit off much more than we can chew. You've seen all these problems with the contractors, shoddy workmanship, and Frank Borman was trying to explain, we identified these things, we're correcting these things, but there were a lot of people in the Congress that wanted to shut Apollo down. And he finally made one impassioned speech there, right in the Congress. And he finally said, I think the people here, meaning the technical folks, we're satisfied that we have the confidence to proceed. The question is, and he looked to Senator Walter Mondale and said, the question is whether you have the confidence in us. And that changed it. And we decided to continue the program. So Frank gets the credit for that. Very smooth on camera.
Side
Very
note
dedicated.
there, who was in the Oval Office with President Nixon when they landed on the moon?
Oh, I would say that Frank Borman.
Yeah, Frank Borman
There
was
you
the
go.
liaison there, explaining everything to Nixon there. So that was kind of interesting too.
Okay, let's look at the rest of the crew. You have Jim Lovell. He is going to be the command module pilot for this flight. Again, United States Navy Academy, an astronaut selected again with Frank Borman in Group 2. Gemini 7, Gemini 12, as we talked about, and again now on Apollo 8. Bill Anders. It's got an unusual title. His name is Lunar Module Pilot for this cruise. The problem is, of course, we don't have a lunar module to be piloted of. But he is still going to be in this crew. He is familiar with a lot of the equipment, of course, on board. He is the 3rd member of the crew. It is his first flight. He is the only one of the 3 that were never a test pilot, but not a test pilot. But that's the crew, and that's the crew that we're going to be sending to the moon. It's the end of December, as Mark mentioned a few minutes ago. The only hope you can have, it's the Christmas season. Launch day is December 21st, just 4 days before Christmas. Hopefully people are concentrating more on Christmas and trying to take a break from the way the world is for a few days. Let's see what happens. Now, Apollo 8, let's look at the challenges. I need to blow this up.
Sure.
Okay, first, the mission was changed. Again, this was supposed to be with the command module, service module, and the lunar module. It's been changed to just orbiting the moon. We will not have a lunar module aboard. We never had a crew launch from this launch pad before, 39A. We never had a crew aboard a Saturn V rocket before. We never had a crew to escape Earth's gravity before. We never had a crew orbit the moon before. We never had a crew that was able to see the entire Earth from space. Now, again, I'd like to focus on that for just a moment. Even when you're in an airplane and you look down, you see the Earth, and you look as far as you can on each horizon, you see the Earth. When you're in space, 250 further miles up, you can still look from end to end, and the Earth pretty much fills your window. When you're going to the moon, and the crew discovers this, you can put up your thumb and hide the Earth. Everything that you know of, every person that ever lived is back there. Every dinosaur that ever roamed the face of the planet is back there. Every writer, every piece of grass, every cockroach, everything that's ever existed is underneath your thumb. Everything out here is black and alien to life. Everything that way towards the Earth is home. Okay. Now, full screen. And then what's going to happen? They're going to make a nighttime landing. So this mission, should all go well, they're going to be landing at night. That's never been done before. And they're going to bring a TV camera. The first time we ever had live TV was on the crew of Apollo 7. We tested out the cameras. It turned out to be a great idea. How could you go to the moon and not bring TV cameras to broadcast live to the people back on Earth? Well, now we're getting ready for launch. Now there's the human side. Again, Apollo has affected people. Again, we're doing a voyage of mythological proportions. We're leaving one world and going to another. They asked the astronauts, Borman, Lovell, and Anders, who do you look up to as a hero? And they all answered that aviation pioneer Charles Lindbergh, the spirit of St. Louis, one man going across the ocean on a trip that many say couldn't be done. Well, Lindbergh himself came to the Cape, and the night before launch spent time with the crew. So they got to see their hero. The very next day, Lindbergh went out to watch the launch. Now, in addition to that, the crew apparently were pretty good Gunsmoke fans. They went to the set.
The biggest show of the
Oh,
year.
at the time, yeah, Gunsmoke had been in the air for something like 20 seasons. They went to the set of Gunsmoke, and they said, look, we can take something in space with us. And what they did is James Arness, who was the star of the show, Matt Dillon, he gave them 4 bullets. These were capless, powderless bullets to take to the moon. And after the flight, the crew sent back to the 4 stars of the show, James Arness, Matt Dillon, Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams, Ken Curtis, who was Festus Hagen, and Amanda Blake, who was Kitty Russell, gave them these bullets that had been left the Earth and came back after circling the moon.
How cool is that?
Now we have launch day. I particularly love this picture. If you look to the right-hand side, you see moonrise. The launch time is 7:51 Eastern Time. Mike Collins, who was going to be on the crew but was taken off because of the problem in his neck, is now the capsule communicator. He is the one that'll be talking to the crew while when they go into space. So he will be talking to the crew instead of being on the crew. Now, if you want to have a great way to celebrate Apollo 8, I can think of no better way of doing it than going to the Kennedy Space Center, going to the Apollo Saturn V Center on the bus tour. There we play the last 3 minutes of the countdown of Apollo 8. Right there in our remade up mission or launch control, you'll get to see every minute, every console, everything happening as it was. It's just an outstanding presentation. And again, this Thursday will be 55 years since it happened.
I'll be out there maybe this weekend, but yeah, they even have the bleachers shaking and
everything. Yeah,
it's a great reenactment there, and a great time. Obviously, 55 years ago, this all happened.
Now, Apollo 8, it's traced to the moon. Now, the way it's shown here, we're going to leave Earth orbit. The Saturn V's first stage will get us up about 40 miles. The second stage will about 115. Third stage will put us into orbit. We'll circle the Earth for a while, make sure everything is working, reignite that third stage to send us on a path to the moon. Now, one more great decision had to be made that we hadn't talked about yet. How are we going to do that first flight? And these were the two thoughts. There's something called a free return trajectory. What is a free return trajectory? Well, a free return trajectory, you'll launch to the moon, and you think that possibly your engine may fail at some point. So, for safety purposes, you put yourself on what's called a free return trajectory. You go towards the moon will grab you and fling you back to Earth. So if you do have an engine failure, you don't have to worry about it. The moon's going to grab you and fling you back to the Earth. You're safe. It was used once on Apollo 13.
Mm-hmm.
We had to do that. We had to get on that free return trajectory because we knew we had a lot of problems on Apollo 13. Couldn't expect anything different. So we had to make sure that we got back to Earth, go on a free return trajectory to get back. Now, the good point about that, it's safe. It's smart. But there's a downside to free return. What's the downside? Well, you're going to the moon to learn something. The way you're going to learn it is by circling the moon, going into orbit, photographing different sites, different locations, different materials, different things on the ground. You can't do that if you're flinging around the moon and going right back to Earth. Now, here's the gamble. In order to do that, you get off that free return trajectory. Then you fire your service module engine once. Now you're going to be in orbit around the moon. Well, you look down, you'll be able to take pictures of all the different potential landing sites, all the different areas of the moon. But the problem comes up getting back to Earth. Now you've been away for X amount of days. You have to be able to fire that engine again to get you back to Earth. The big problem people were thinking about was that engine firing will become late on Christmas Eve, early on Christmas Day. If that engine doesn't fire that second time, the crew will be in orbit around the moon forever on Christmas.
But that's a
Now-
good thing because Santa can come and
Well,
get him and bring him back, right?
Well, we'll see how that worked out. Okay, so that was the debate. Well, the decision was made, no, we're going to the moon. We're going to not go on the free return trajectory. We're going to go into orbit. And if all goes well, we want to do 10 orbits, then come back to Earth. So that's the mission plan. Moving ahead. Now, the way the vehicle is in orbit, everything goes well. We're in orbit around the moon. An unusual orientation. The crew cannot see the Earth. It's looking down at the lunar surface. And that's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. It's going to be that way for the first 3 orbits. Now, to orbit the moon takes about 2 hours. So we have a 2-hour orbit. They're going to orbit the moon for 20 hours, which is the 10 orbits. So as they complete orbit 3, they're getting ready for orbit 4. Hadn't really thought about this, but let's go to the next slide. Orbit number 4. Now, right now at orbit number 4, we're about 3 days, 3 hours into the mission. The crew is going about their business. Look out the window as their orientation of the spacecraft has changed, and this is a dramatic moment that is going to change mankind forever. The crew looks out, and I believe it was Jim Lovell that looked out first, and there in the distance, coming up, just like a sunrise on Earth, is the Earth coming up from behind the moon. And again, if you can put that slide up between this slide and you can go to the next page, there is a conversation. And for the folks at home, if you are watching this, it's unfortunately we don't have an audio capability here, but the crew is talking to each other, and Jim Lovell is very concerned. He says, you have got to get a picture of this. Frank Borman jokes with him and says, well, it's not on the established picture list of the pictures we're supposed to take. Quickly, we got to get a picture. Well, they have black and white film. No. You got to get color film. This is a great photo. And this goes on for a few minutes, and they finally get to the canister of the color film and get the color film. If we can advance another slide here.
Yes, I'm mesmerized by
And it's
reading
really,
that, quite frankly.
I mean, one of my favorite conversations is if you look about halfway down, It's Bill Anders saying, calm down, Lovell, calm down.
Yeah.
And because, again, this is a moment, again, you're going across the surface of the moon at 2 miles a second. You don't want to miss this Earthrise. And so they do get the picture. Let's take a look at the picture. That's the picture. Now, you might say, you don't remember that picture. Well, that's the picture as it was taken. The Earth coming up over the moon. It was taken about 11:40 in the morning, Eastern time on December 24th, Christmas Eve. Position about 110 degrees east. 250 miles away is the lunar surface, where the horizon is. Now, what we're going to do on the next slide is give you an idea of what you're able to see from here. It's NASA photo. It shows the photo number. You can see the Earth's terminator. The terminator is the dividing line between light and darkness. So if you look, you can see the south pole of the Earth. It's to the bottom, slightly to the left. The terminator, which is the day-night side, is across Africa. The surface of the moon, you can see 250 miles away. The orbit of Apollo 8 is about 65 miles or so above the surface of the moon. Now, that's the photo as it was taken. But for dramatic purposes, they rotated it 90 degrees, and that's the photo you're probably more familiar with. Mm-hmm. So it was a 90-degree rotation of that to show that what we would expect a sunrise to look like, or in our case, an Earthrise of the Earth coming above the lunar surface. Now, let's go to the next slide. Now, we knew that the crew was going to be in orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve. It was thought that it would be nice, it would be appropriate if the commander of the flight said something special. It's been a very tough year, as you all just witnessed, and you're doing something very unusual. You're as far away from home as anyone has ever been. It's a voyage of mythological proportions. You're orbiting the moon. Come up with something to say. If we can go to a full screen here. Mm-hmm. And so Frank Borman's having a hard time. The wife of the Bureau of the Budget employee, Joseph Layton, comes up with an idea. That's Christine Layton. She says, instead of trying to invent something to say, why don't you do something that's simple? What would that be? And she suggests, just read the first 10 verses out of the Bible. It is Christmas Eve. You are talking about the earth and the moon, what the world was like when it just began. Well, Layton liked the idea, tells Borman. Borman likes the idea, talks to the crew, and the decision is made. We're not going to say something profound. We're just going to read from the Bible. That's profound enough. So Bill Anders begins the broadcast reading from Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. And then Jim Lovell will pick up at verse 4, talking about the creation of the earth. Finally, Frank Borman will end it. Let the waters from under the firmament be separated from the waters above the firmament, and so. And God called the waters and separated the waters, etc., and so on. And God saw that it was good. And he ends with, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Mm. And that's the end of the broadcast. Apollo 8 is now going to go on the other side of the moon. Now it's up to that engine, the engine you see there on the slide.
Pause there just a second.
Sure.
There. Got it before we get them back. That makes my hair on my arm stand up hearing that. One important factor of this whole reading was it was in prime time. It was like 8 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. Our family was having the outlaw party of everybody at our house. I had my telescope outside in the backyard. I'm just sharing my personal experience because millions of you have that personal experience. It was quite a moment, and it was not like 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning or something like that. Like the Apollo 11 moon landing was 5 in the afternoon on a Sunday, but they didn't put their boots on the ground till 11:30 that night. And but this was very, very special. And as your graphic said, there are over 1 billion people on Earth. That was only 4 billion people
That's right.
at the time. Approximately a quarter of humanity watched and listened to that. And I'd like to also say it was a Christian message, but they endorsed it and NASA endorsed it because they felt it spoke to all of Earth's religions, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And again, when you think about that, there was a joke about that a little bit later. But what happened when the Apollo 8 crew was invited to Congress? Because there was some protesting. The fact is that they read that, and they're government employees, and they read this at prime time. And the joke was when the Apollo 8 crew addressed this joint session of the Congress, in the front row is the Supreme Court justices as well. Now that I see the justices in the Supreme Court, maybe we should have thought about this. But again, but that's that's kind of an aside. But it was such a dramatic moment.
And the moon, by the way,
right
is
there.
going beneath you. They just set the camera there, and you can see the moon slowly orbit. You just heard their words, and I will replay it on Christmas Eve myself, and I'll post it on our Facebook webpage, our Facebook page, so you all can hear and share that. But I mean, it was really more dramatic than the moon landing in many ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Steve. But the excellent way you've characterized this and brought it full circle here with us. So continue.
So
my
you
friend.
have Apollo 8's on the other side of the moon. So everything depends on that one engine. Oop, I think we went one. There we go.
All right.
Everything's depending on that one engine to fire. Again, it could go, if it doesn't work, that crew is going to be trapped in lunar orbit forever. What a terrible way to end this year. When they reemerge from the moon, normally you say something like, burn was on time, burn, here's the parameters and such. Jim Lovell answers the call, Apollo 8, and Jim Lovell says, Houston, please be advised that there is a Santa Claus. And that's how Houston finds out that the burn went well and the crew is back to Earth. 3
Heading
days
back to
later,
Earth,
heading
yeah.
back to Earth. So 3 days later, they're going to land. It'll be picked up in the Pacific Ocean by the aircraft carrier Yorktown. A funny story about the Yorktown that I read a couple of years ago. That was the last major thing that the aircraft carrier Yorktown did.
And as you mentioned,
Was
it was a
picked up,
night launch.
and it was a night landing. Yeah, and it was the last major thing that the Yorktown did. One of the things it did after that is it did Hollywood work. And oddly enough, that poor carrier Yorktown that picked up the Apollo 8 crew, next big thing they did was to act as a Japanese carrier in the film Tora, Tora, Tora.
Oh, really?
So there you have it. That's kind of an
Interesting.
unusual aside on the Yorktown.
It certainly is.
Now, what I'd like to do now is to take a look back in history. About 103 years before, a man named Jules Verne talked about a trip from the Earth to the moon. Let's proceed one more slide. And of course, he's a science fiction writer, and he makes a lot of predictions. Well, in the year 1865, America just finished the Civil War. To give you an idea, for those folks that are listening that are not familiar with American history, America just finished the Civil War. It's 1865, and he writes a book, From the Earth to the Moon, the first flight from the Earth to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
He predicts the country that will make the flight, and again, he's from France, but the country that will make the flight will be the United States. Well, of course, it's the United States. Where will the launch site be? He said it will be in the state of Florida. Well, it was in the state of Florida. Well, how many in the crew? He said it will be a crew of 3. Well, when will they launch it? Well, they will launch it in the month of December. Well, in Jules Verne's book, the launch area will be on the coastline of Florida. But he picked the west coast instead of the east coast, but very close to the same latitude, about halfway down the coast. How big is the spacecraft? Well, Apollo was about 12 feet wide. His spacecraft was about just a little bit larger than that. What it'll be made out of? Well, Apollo 8 and Jules Verne's spacecraft were both made out of aluminum.
Mm-hmm.
The weight was very, very close, a little over 20,000 pounds for Apollo, and about 19,000 for his spacecraft. The speed that they're going to be going, and the traveling speed, almost identical. The distance to the moon, almost identical. How long would they stay in orbit? we had one day. Jules Verne predicted about 2 days. They would land in the Pacific Ocean just like he said they would. The recovery ship would be a United States Navy ship. The total mission cost up to Apollo 8 was about $14 billion for the United States. Jules Verne said about $12 billion.
Really?
Now, the most interesting thing to me is the crew. The crew of 3. Well, he names the crew. The commander will be a man named Barbican. In real life, it was Borman. The second in command is a man named Nickel. In real life, it'll be Level. The third would be a man named Arden. In real life, it was Anders. Arden was a Frenchman. Anders is of French descent. That is pretty good for predicting 103 years in the future.
Absolutely. Jules Verne, From Earth to the Moon, a giant cannon sent them
That's right.
there. H.G. Wells's version, Calverite.
Calverite. Yeah.
And I love that version too, with the aliens and the Selenites and
now
the moon there. What a nice comparison there, and of course, in many ways, Apollo 8, they say, won the moon race with Russia, though we didn't even land.
Now, one of the ways I really wanted to end the program today, and we're getting very close to the end right now, is how did Apollo 8 change things? You take a look. Let's go to the next slide and do full screen on it. After Apollo 8, Time magazine said the man of the year, they do this every year, for 1968 was going to be the protester. And the reason is we had protests on the Vietnam War. We had protests on the death of Martin Luther King. We had protest marches throughout the year, civil rights. We had the riots at the conventions. The protester was the big person of the year. At the last minute, they changed it and made the crew of Apollo 8 the men of the year. A few months after Apollo 8, a postage stamp with that moonrise picture was issued on May 5th, 1969, with the words, "In the beginning, God, ... A year after Apollo 8, the first Earth Day occurs on April 22nd of 1970. It changed the way
6 months after
human people.
Apollo 8, actually.
Yeah, it's actually about a year because they came back at the end of '68. Right. But it has, it completely changed the way people thought of the Earth as being infinite, and now you can see it's not infinite. It's small enough to put under your thumb. So that changed the way. And the way I told Mark I really wanted to end this, it was to wrap everything up by saying this. After the landing back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8, needless to say, got congratulations from everywhere, one around the world. World leaders, businessmen, tycoons, the general public. And Frank Borman, I believe, was asked once, what one thing do you remember the most? He says it was a simple letter. And from a simple person that
got thousands and thousands.
He got thousands of these letters from everywhere. And it was very simple. All it says is, thank you for saving 1968. Because this was a year that people wanted to blot out of their lives. And there it was, a simple message. Apollo 8 saved 1968. And I hope you'll have a better understanding of what a big decision this was to do the moon flight. And just in case, just to reinforce that, a year from now, next November, as it sits right now, we're expecting to send the Artemis 2 mission with a crew of 4, 3 Americans, 1 Canadian, to go to the moon. Right now, as it stands right now, they're going on a free return trajectory to go about 4,000 miles beyond the moon and instantly come back to Earth, just to be on the safe side. So the idea is that here we are 52 years later since the last moon landing. And again, we're opting for the safe free return trajectory on the Artemis mission. Things can change, but as it stands now, you can see what a dramatic decision that was in 1968.
Without the lunar module, and you saw what the lifeboat the lunar module provided
for Apollo 13,
Apollo 13, of course. That was a bold move. And you contrast this against the dollars. It was just. I mean, I look back, Steve. What's your comment about, like, you had this political unrest, you had the civil rights problems, you had our country was going through all kinds of growing pains. These assassinations of our leaders was quite disturbing on a level of and here constantly people like Jim Webb, the NASA administrator, Bob Mueller, one of his right hand people, Gilruth over Johnson Space Center, going to Congress, having to justify all the time the money that a lot of people thought was a waste of money because why are we spending all that money to go to the moon?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem that they didn't understand was not $1 was spent in outer space.
Yeah, that's it. Every dollar you spend is on Earth. One of the questions we get all the time, Mark, and obviously you can't be a stranger to that, is is it worth it? And again, what I usually do is, well, when you wake up in the morning, let's think of all the things that are there because of the space program. Everything from live by satellite, weather forecasting, we launched the first Tyros satellite.
Everyone's looking at the weather in
Right.
Florida this weekend,
Exactly.
and up on the coast where it's
And you
wreaking
had,
some havoc.
if you
Absolutely.
if you look at some of the weather broadcasts in the late 50s, well, we heard the next town's having a rainstorm. It's heading this way. Here,
Yeah.
especially for the folks here in Florida, you get at least a week or so of notice that hurricanes are coming. So the best speech I've ever heard, and this will be a good way to end it if you want to talk about it. The best space speech I ever heard was given by a fellow named Hubert Humphrey, the same vice president of the United States in 1972 when he was running for president. He decided to attack it a completely different way. I've never heard anybody do it this way, and I thought it was just great. He says, let's do it this way. He says, we have satellites in space, and their only job is to detect nuclear explosions. The idea is that we don't want to get a sneak nuclear attack. If all the money in the space program was just devoted to that we wouldn't be surprised by a nuclear attack, it would be worth it. Communication satellites that you can call anywhere in the world. If the space program just did that, it would be worth it. If it was for the weather satellites that predict storms, that you can take precautions to be safe, to save your life, if it did just that, it would be worth it. If the medical research we've gotten from space, if it just did that, and he just went on and on and on and on. And he ended with, well, it does all of that. For at that time was about 6 cents on the dollar, and now it's less than a penny of the tax dollar.
Right.
He says we did all of that, and we threw in that Apollo thing also. So there's no question in your mind. So the question is not whether it's a waste, is whether or not you think this is money well spent. Gene Cernan called it technological life insurance. The idea is you spend the money to do the research, you're going to come up with breakthroughs. Those breakthroughs are going to lead to other breakthroughs. You can see that so much now with the rise of the internet, where people all around the world are getting more involved. Look at the way commercial space has taken over. We have SpaceX hoping to get 100 launches this year. 100 launches. Think about that. So a lot of the other commercial companies, Blue Origin, coming up. They should be launching their vehicle from here next year. Voyage Space will be coming up. Relativity Space already launched a vehicle from here. So all these commercial companies, and I think it's great because that is going to take that question away. Because if the commercial companies are making money, you can't say it's just the government's problem anymore. If the commercial companies see the value, the people will generally see the value very shortly thereafter.
Space commerce will create a sort of gold rush of what's in outer space, and we're witnessing it here in the quarter of the way through the 21st century. And a wonderful program here with Steve Agid. Love that you've embraced our museum and want to help us so many ways. He's a great educator out there at the Kennedy Space Center. Let's end today's program with just kind of the big elephant in the room for you and me. We've not been back in 50 years. My God, you and I as kids thought there'd be Antarctica-style lunar bases with 20 or 30 people living there all the time. Is it truly politics, or do you think people really, there's just a small segment of society that really wants to explore space?
Well, the way I can look at it, and again, I love exploration history, and it's very odd that you just mentioned Antarctica. There was a golden age of Arctic exploration, the early 1900s. We had the explorers like Nansen and Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton, and the goal was to reach the pole. At the end of 1911, Roald Amundsen and his group reached the pole. Early in 1912, Robert Falcon Scott. Then you had other explorers. And then the pole was just put on hold. That's it. Many decades went by. And all of a sudden, we started doing polar research again. Then we started setting up a lot of science at the pole. Now at Scott Amundsen Base, we have a lot of different research facilities. And Antarctica is demilitarized. Okay, everyone's invited there. You have your facility, I have my facility, and everyone's in the same place doing research. It takes a while for that to happen. That exploration goes through phases. Arthur Clarke says the same thing with technology. Technology, he says, goes through 3 phases. The first phase is it's impossible, it can't be done. The second phase is, well, it's possible, but it's never going to be practical for the average guy. And the third phase is, hey, don't look at me. I told you it was a good idea all along. He says right now, space is right in the middle of phase 2. It's possible, but it's never going to be practical for the average guy. When I came down here to the Space Center in 1988 to pick up working on the shuttle program, I put in a suggestion that, rather radical, that the Kennedy Space Center ought to go on this new thing called the World Wide Web.
You were radical.
There you go. Yeah, that's the idea, because apparently a lot of people, when Bill Clinton became president, to give you an idea, Bill Clinton was sworn in as president on January 20th, 1993. There were 50 sites on the World Wide Web. That's it.
Wow.
Okay. So
in 93.
1993, January 20th.
So that's 30 years.
Yeah, that's it. So the idea of how these things have exploded. Space is the same thing. Would you have expected a company to put nearly 100 rockets in space in 1 year, developing its own satellite system,
Yeah, let alone
sending
5,000
people in
satellites.
space? Depending, I mean, if you want to look back, one of the things I used, I said, we get this all the time. We had people that say we didn't believe they landed on the moon. Okay. I said, some people believed it would happen. Some people didn't think it would happen. All right, it happened. But here's the one thing to make you think out there. And again, it reflects on your question, Mark. When we watched Armstrong step foot on the moon that evening of July 20th, 1969, many people were probably amazed that it actually happened. Many people said, nope, I had confidence. But I will tell you one thing, that I can tell you out of every billions of people on Earth at that time, not one would have said 50 years from now, in the far off age of 2019, the only way to send an American into space would be to have him learn how to speak Russian so he can go in a Russian craft.
Got a point there.
Okay, so think about that. Just because you're a leader at one point doesn't guarantee you're going to be a leader forever. One of the other things we talk about, the Wright brothers, just last week, just yesterday, 120th anniversary of the flight.
Yeah.
Right, they invented the airplane, got the technology here. Not one American airplane was in the First World War. Had American pilots, not one American airplane. Okay, just because you invent something, if you don't take advantage of it, it's not guaranteed.
Well, astronaut, one of the moonwalkers alive, Harrison Schmitt, says we blew the opportunity after Apollo, his mission on Apollo 17. We had the world showing what technical achievements we could do, and we really didn't capitalize on it. We did share the technology with the rest of the world and so forth. Well, what a fascinating hour or so we've had here with Steve Agid. We want Steve to come back and do more programs with us. We hope that you all enjoyed today's lessons learned of Apollo 8. Selvin sat down to pinch hit for Marty as we started early today. So those of you that looking for us at 4 o'clock, now you can realize you can find us anytime, thanks to the World Wide Web.
Well, I was going to bring up one more thing, Marty.
Sure.
Mark, as you just mentioned, you said about this, what we deciding to do and not deciding to do. Jim Lovell had a statement. I thought it was great. When people says, wasn't it a miracle that we went to the moon? And he says, no, it was not a miracle. We just decided to do it.
That's a cool
There
way
you
to end
go.
the program. God bless you, Jim Lovell, 95 years old, or is he 96? And
oldest
lost his
American
good
astronaut,
buddy,
yeah.
Jim Frank Borman. We lost
yeah.
him a month ago. Bill Anders is still around at age 88 or so. So we love thinking about our Apollo era all the time. You're going to see the moon up in the sky during this Christmas week. So think about these brave men in this spacecraft here. They couldn't get back here in this part of it. Many of you don't understand the cylindrical part. Nope, that was tanks and communication systems and so forth. There's just a little cylinder, conical shape there that those guys are in. So, Steve, thank you for another great
Welcome.
program. Hope that you've all joined this today. And Selvin, anybody, did he write a name down watching today?
He wrote Dave Stange, Bill,
Thank you, Dave Stange, first
Bill
week of
Whiting.
retirement. Bill Whiting.
Steve J, and O.S. Walker.
All right, Steve Yokin and who? Walker?
Walker.
All right, good to have you all on board here. Tell your friends to watch us. We got programs the rest of the week. We have Perry Baker Horner, a communications management person, about the pieces and parts of the shuttle. Wednesday, we're going to talk about the ISS Christmases. Thursday will be some stargazing from your backyard on Christmas night. And Friday, talk about what was the Star of Bethlehem, a program I've done over 40 years. So you'll be amazed what you think it is. Until then, thank you, Steve Agid, for a great program on Apollo 8. Tell your friends to watch this over the holidays. They'll learn so much. Until next time, I'm Mark Marquette saying thank you, and I can't wait to see you in our museum to bridge the space between us. Tremendous.
Are we off?